question that I get asked all the time when I go to speak at schools is, where on earth do I begin with coding? How do I get started? And I noticed that I always give the same answer.
Run, far away, don't look back, just keep running.
But seriously, I do always give the same answer to complete beginners. And in this video, I'm going to answer that question, give you a little bit of an insight into programming as a whole, and get you coding today. And I'm going to do it as quick as I possibly can. So let's go. Hi there folks, I'm Ben and welcome back to the channel. As usual, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and of course subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of what I do. So let me reveal the answer immediately so that you can click off this video if it's not to your liking. I always tell beginners that want to get into coding to learn how to make websites. I know this won't be a popular opinion amongst my programming colleagues, but hear me out. When I say learning to make websites, I mean more specifically learning HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that looks something like on my screen here. This website is called CodePen. It's a fantastic free-to-use website that lets you write HTML, JavaScript, and CSS directly in your browser and see the results immediately. It separates your screen up into 4 panels. The top left one is the HTML that I'm writing. The middle one is the CSS that I'm writing, and on the right is the JavaScript. Along the bottom is the actual generated website from the 3 combined code bases. So if I make a change here from hello world to be hello Ben and wait for just a second, it will save and update, and you can see that my changes have rendered into the new website. The great thing about CodePen is that I can code live. So any changes that I make in any of these 3 files along the top will immediately be reflected in the generated website at the bottom, allowing me to have sort of a play area or a place to practice. Again, over here in the CSS, if I change this red to be green, wait for a little second, and it's changed the color of the text to be green. You get the picture. Let me justify my answer of learning to make websites with 5 quick points. 1. By learning HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, it will allow you to really quickly prototype an idea that you have, especially if it's one that has a user interface. HTML as the language to lay out your page and CSS as the language to sort of make it look good, combined together give you a really quick way of checking if your designs and your prototypes are actually any good. And of course they work immediately. Number 2, you can run your code pretty much anywhere. As long as the machine that you're trying to use your code on has an internet browser like Chrome or Firefox, then your code will run. Number 3, JavaScript is one of, if not the most popular programming language in the entire world. There was a Stack Overflow survey back in 2018 and it was crowned the most used programming language. Not only because most websites use JavaScript, but because of awesome, wonderful things like Node.js that allow you to write JavaScript that isn't just for websites, that's for backend servers, for example. Number 4, a pretty obvious one, but you can make your own websites. You can create an e-portfolio of your work if you like. And finally, number 5, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, in comparison to many other programming languages out there in the world, are incredibly easy to learn and to pick up. So those are my 5 reasons for why I always answer the question, how do I start coding with make websites? Right then, let's do some learning. Because you might only be interested in certain parts of this video, here are some timestamps that I have lovingly given so you can skip to the sections that you're interested in. Otherwise, let's start at the top. Let's talk very briefly about programming as a concept. So what actually is coding or programming? Programming is simply writing a set of instructions for a computer so that the computer can take those instructions and follow them, step by step. You're essentially telling a computer what to do. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Computers are incredibly dumb and they don't understand our sort of direct commands, how we would say them at least. I can't just go to a computer,
"Hey computer, write a calculator program, go,"
and expect it to do what I want it to do. The computer doesn't understand my English. Computers only really talk one language, and that's binary, ones and zeros, which actually really represent electrical flow, on or off, 1 or 0. So in order to make my job as a programmer not be writing millions and billions of ones and zeros in order to tell the computer what I want it to do, some very clever people came up with a middle ground, a common shared way of a human developer to communicate to a machine without having to use ones and zeros. And these are called programming languages. And there are loads of them. Yeah. Most programming languages look completely different to one another. Their syntax, or the way that they are written, is different, but the underlying concepts are mostly the same across programming languages. They have common ways of solving logical problems, like if this is happening, then do that. Otherwise, do something else. They also have ways of looping around constantly or for a certain number of times to do processes over and over again. They have ways to store and transfer information, and most of them have ways of feeding back to the user, printing some output saying, hey user, this is happening, or hey user, I need some information from you. Some of the popular programming languages include C, C++, Java, JavaScript, of course, Kotlin, Swift. The list goes on. And each programming language actually has its own advantages and disadvantages. And it's more about picking the right tool for the job. And fun little side fact, there's actually a programming language that exists in the world that's called Arnold C. And it's a programming language that's based on one-liners from Arnold Schwarzenegger and his various movies that he's been in. It's nuts. If you're interested in looking at that language that's on the screen here, I'll leave a link in the description down below. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS are programming languages. HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, is actually a markup language, which is essentially just a language that describes how things should look, the layout of a page. CSS is Cascading Style Sheets, and that's a domain-specific declarative language, which basically just says how things should be styled. And of course, JavaScript is an interpreted programming language. Once you've written a program in a programming language, usually the computer has to take that and translate it back into its own method of understanding, back into ones and zeros. This process is called compilation or compiling. However, not all programs need to be compiled. Some are interpreted. The reason that I'm explaining this is because HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, these are interpreted languages. And interpreted basically means that there is usually a piece of software that sits between the programming language, the code that you've written, and what the computer can understand. And this man in the middle, this interpreter, is passing that code through and translating it to the computer to do things. Well, sort of. It's a very rough explanation. And you can imagine that the piece of software, the interpreter, that sits in the middle for us, in our example, for HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, is a web browser. Our web browser, for example Chrome, will read these files and interpret them. It will do certain things with the information. For example, display a button on screen. And actually, when you go to visit a website, for example Google, you're simply asking a computer somewhere else in the world, hey, please give me your files, your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files to my browser. Your browser takes it, interprets it, and puts it on the screen. When I start explaining HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to students, I always give this analogy. HTML is the language that you use to set the page's layout, so the structure. And I make the analogy that HTML is the skeleton. So you're saying what exists where. The head is on the top, the body's in the middle, the arms are to the side. You're saying the layout, the position, where things are going to be. HTML on its own would make a very, very boring, ugly website. It would be laid out, there would be things to click and words to look at, but it would not look good at all. And that's where CSS comes in. CSS is like the clothing, the skin, the hairstyle, the shirt, the shorts. This is how the website looks. The colors, the fonts, the sizing, the alignment, the spacing. HTML and CSS combined makes a nice website, a static website that sort of is just reading material. It's words, it's pictures, you can look at it, you can click some things, but not a lot happens. And that's where JavaScript comes in, the final component. JavaScript is like the brains. In this case, it's the HTML, the skeleton, the CSS with the clothes and the skin, doing stuff. It's the logic, it's the brain. It's actually things happening. JavaScript enables me to do logical things and make the page more interactive and exciting and actually things happening on it. For example, I could, if it's morning in the real world, if the time is in the morning, I could make the page look like a nice sun rising in the background. And if the time is in the evening and it's getting darker outside, then the sun could be setting. JavaScript, the logic, the brains behind the operation, lets me do these cool things. Combine together HTML for the layout, CSS for the looks, and JavaScript for the logic, the brain, creates a really decent, good, interactive website. These three languages look different to each other. That is, the syntax, the way that you type it, the code itself looks different in each programming language. So now let's actually get hands-on with some code. Just a quick note, this video isn't supposed to be a full deep dive tutorial on HTML, JavaScript, or CSS. It's more of a way to showcase to you where to begin, how on earth to start. Of course, I'll show you loads of websites that you can go to help you continue your learning so that you can dive deeper into the rabbit hole. If you want to give some of this coding a go yourself, what you're going to need is just two things. One, a web browser to actually run your code in. This can be Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Internet Explorer. Ooh. That's nice and simple. You've probably got one of those already. The second thing you're going to need is a place to write code. You're going to need something called a plain text editor. Examples of a plain text editor are Visual Studio Code, Sublime Text Editor, and Atom. There's links in the description down below to find these. Important to note, you need to use a plain text editor. Notepad would be an acceptable program, but not something like Microsoft Word, because Microsoft Word actually, when you're using it, puts hidden files and hidden things into the file itself to make it look pretty or to format it. And we need an application that will just take what we write and not add anything at all to it. Because of course, when you're coding, you have to stick to the programming language so that the computer can understand what you want. So as you can see on my screen here, I'm using a program called Visual Studio Code, which was created by Microsoft and is probably one of the most popular plain text editors out there. You can see on the left here, I have a folder in my machine that I've created called Website. I've just made a folder. Inside of that folder, I've used this button, the Make a New File button, to create a file called index.html. It's important to note, HTML files finish with the suffix .html, so index.html. JavaScript files finish with the .js suffix, and CSS files finish with the .css suffix. Let's create an incredibly simple HTML file and just see how it works. HTML uses something called tags to declare and describe how it should be laid out. These tags always have a starting tag and a finishing tag that look the exact same way, but a starting tag doesn't have a /, so this one for example, and a finishing tag, a closing tag, always has a / before the word inside of it. A tag consists of an angled bracket, an opening angled bracket, some word that HTML will understand, and then a closing angled bracket. So for example, I made a head tag with an opening angle bracket, the word head, and then a closing angle bracket. And of course, every tag that starts needs its partner closing tag. So this HTML has a closing HTML, and this head has a closing head. HTML pages are actually quite simple. Everything in HTML is wrapped inside of these HTML tags. And inside of the HTML tags, so everything within this starting tag and before the end of this starting tag is within that space. The head tags are useful for creating metadata about the page, so describing, for example, the page title and all of the dependencies and other pages that this page is bringing in, the head. And below the head, of course, is the body, and the body is actually where all of your HTML code goes for actually creating the page layout. So inside the head, I might have a title tag, and again, remember, a starting tag needs a closing tag, and the title tag is actually the title that goes in the little tab at the top of the page for inside of Chrome. And inside the body, for now, I'll just put text in. I'll put in hello world. I'm going to save the file, and then I'm actually just going to see the file in my Explorer window or in my Finder window, depending on what operating system you're using, and I'm going to drag it and I'm going to drop it into my browser. So I'm just dragging it and dropping it into Chrome, and Chrome will now take that code and interpret it and understand it. And you can see the words hello world have been written. They're quite small over there. So now if I go back to VSCode and change something, so hello Ben instead of hello world, save it, go back to the browser and refresh it, with the refresh button you can see that hello world changed to hello Ben. It's quite small there in the top left. And this title bit, Ben's page, the title tag actually means the bit that's displayed up in this tab in Chrome here. So as I described, inside of this starting body tag and closing body tag, within the space between them is where I will put my important HTML code that will describe the actual page's layout. And HTML has a huge list of different tags that you can use that do different things. For example, there's a H1 tag, which is a header tag. So it's like a title. I'm going to type in between the opening and closing H1 tags, Ben's page. And I'm going to save, and I'm going to go back to the browser, and I'm going to refresh, and you can see the header has popped up and it's sort of bigger text. There is a H1 all the way to H6, and they get smaller as you go. So a H5 tag, I'm just going to type some nonsense in there, save it, go back to the browser, refresh, and you can see the text is different. There is, of course, button tags, which are incredibly important. So a button that will say click me. I'm going to save it, refresh the page, and you can see it's rendered a button that I can sort of click, but nothing happens. There are, of course, image tags, which lets you display images on the page. And image tags work slightly different. They don't need a closing tag as well, because all of the information is inside the first tag itself. It doesn't need to close anything. It's all contained within that little element itself. And inside of the image tag itself, so before the closing bracket closes, there are two attributes that are given to me when I auto-generate this code. I'm going to get rid of alt. We're not really interested in that at the moment. But there's attributes inside this tag. So the tag name itself, img, space, then the name of the attribute that we want to deal with, equal sign, and your actual value inside of speech marks. And in this case, the source, the src attribute, is just saying, hey, which image do you want me to display? And for this example, I've brought over this ben.png into the same folder that my HTML file is in. That's really important. And inside of those speech marks, I'm just going to write ben.png, and I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go back to my page and refresh it, and you can see that there is the image displayed massively. As I said, I'm not going to go deep at all into any of these programming languages, just give a bit of a flavor. And I want to point you now to a really, really incredibly useful link that's on a website called W3 Schools. And W3 Schools has loads of learning resources and loads of information about our three programming languages that we're looking at today. And when you go onto w3schools.com, if you scroll down on the left, there is a references section. And if you click on the HTML reference, you're brought to this page, and it's a HTML element reference. And this will just literally show you all the different tags that you can use in your page. And of course, a description of each. Link in the description down below. Have a go yourself, play with some of the tags, see what you can do, see what you can make. Just remember that HTML document is made up of a opening and closing HTML tag. Inside of that is where all the HTML itself will live. There is a head tag that opens and closes that describes the page itself, and there is a body tag that opens and closes and has all of the layout code itself, the actual body, the meat of the page. And inside of there, you put all of your different building blocks, your elements that you want to use. So that's very quickly HTML. Let's look at CSS now and start to make the site look pretty. The first important thing to note is that you can either have CSS inside of the same HTML file that you're writing in now. It can just be embedded inside of a style tag right inside the head. So you can create a style tag inside of the head tags, and you can just write your CSS in there if you like, and it will be fine, it will be understandable. Or alternatively, you can add a line like this into your head tags, which is a link tag that points to a CSS file. So this href is actually pointing to a different CSS file, and that way you can keep your HTML and CSS in different files. It just makes it easier to read and easier to make changes. So this main.css file doesn't actually exist yet, so I'm just going to create it, a new file, main.css, and again, it's going to live in the same folder that my HTML file is living in. So now my HTML points to the CSS file, and everything that I write in here will be included in my website. As I said, CSS looks completely different to HTML. This is how some CSS looks. You describe the things, the elements, the IDs, the classes, I'll talk about that in a second, that you want to change the appearance of, and then you open a curly bracket and you close a curly bracket. And then everything inside of those two curly brackets will be the properties that those things will take on. So for example, H1s, if I say, hey, H1s, I want you to have the color of red. Every line has a property or the actual attribute name, so color, for example. If you go back to the W3 Schools website and click on the CSS reference instead, it'll take you to this page, which has a huge list of CSS properties, and again, a description for each so that you know what properties you can use. And if we just scroll down to C, we can see color, the one that I just used, sets the color of text. Nice and easy to understand. So if I go back, we have the actual property name, a colon, and then the actual property you want to set it to. CSS understands color names, so I can set red, green, blue, black, any color I like. I'm going to set it to red, and then CSS lines need to finish with a semicolon. That's quite a common occurrence in programming languages, finishing lines with semicolons, but we'll not get into that in this video. I'm going to save that, and now because my index.html has this important link that points to the CSS file, when I save both files and go back to my page and refresh it, you can see that immediately the color of the text of Ben's page changed to red, because now the HTML there and the CSS is also brought in. The next thing I'm going to do is change the size of this image just to make it a bit smaller. I'm going to type in on a new line img to say, hey, I want those image tags to change. Open curly, close curly, and inside of those two brackets, I'm going to just do something like width. And I'm going to just make it 100 px for 100 pixels. Okay, all of the information on these width and these different property attributes can be found back in that W3 Schools website. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to the website and refresh, and you can see the image has gone down to now 100 pixels. Great. Other than actually stating the tag names that you want to affect, you can affect individual elements by giving it an ID, a unique identifier string. So first of all, let's go over to the HTML. Let's make another h1 tag underneath, and we're going to change the word to be someone's page. So there's Ben's page and someone's page, and if I just go back to the website, both Ben's page and someone's page are red. And that's because in the CSS, we just said here, all h1s should have the color red. So I can give any tag in HTML an ID attribute just by typing ID equals and then speech marks and opening and closing speech marks, and then give it any identifier that I want to. So I can just make this other h1, save it. Okay, that one, and if I just go back to the page, it won't actually look any different yet. It's just a piece of information that's sort of in the background for HTML and CSS to use. But then to actually affect that individual element, I'm going to do the name I gave it, so other h1, and in front of it, so the ID name that I gave it, other h1, and in front of it, I'm going to give a hashtag, and the hashtag basically stands for ID. So ID, other h1, go to the end, opening and closing curly brackets, and inside of there, I can give this one the color of blue instead. And if I go back to the page, you can see Ben's page is red, and someone's page is blue, because the red came from the generic h1 rule, and the other h1 ID rule was color blue, and of course we told this element to have the ID of other h1, so it all links together. The other useful component is classes. So if you again didn't want to just use tag names like h1 to describe your rules, you can give like a class name to multiple elements can have the same class, and they can all be affected by that rule. To make a class, I'm going to go to the index, and I've got Ben's page, someone's page, and more pages, and currently they'll all be taking on the h1 rule. I'm going to give them a class property attribute equals speech marks, open and close, and inside of there I'll just make up a class name. I'm going to be calling it my class. Okay, and I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it into the h1 below. So there's multiple h1s that exist with the class my class. Okay, so that's done. Again, right now if I change it, they'll all be taking on the h1 rule of color red. If I go back to here and I go into my CSS and I write the name of my class, but instead of just leaving it like that, and obviously I'm not putting a hashtag because that would mean ID my class, I'm going to put a dot my class. So dot means class, so class my class, whereas hashtag meant ID, dot means my class. Open and close curly brackets, and inside of there I'm going to give the color green and save it and go back to my page, and you can see the ones that have the class of my class have taken on the rules that I've made for my class. So there's a very, very quick, brief explanation of CSS. Again, just showing you what's possible so that you can learn yourself. Remember to use that W3 Schools link and of course that massive CSS reference guide to help you understand what attributes are out there, what you can actually change. You can pretty much change everything. Finally, onto our last language, JavaScript, that gives the interactiveness and the brains behind the website. Again, you can actually just have JavaScript directly in that same HTML file that we're making by using a script tag. And inside of here, you can make JavaScript and it will be fine and it will run. Or alternatively, you can use a line that looks like this, that again, like that link line above for CSS, this line points at another file. So this points to a file called main.js. So this is our JavaScript file. And this again is just to keep the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS code independent in their own files. So it's not just one big massive file of all the different languages. Of course, this file doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to make a new file, main.js, and now my file exists. So when I refresh my page in my browser, the JavaScript will also be included because of this line here that points to the JavaScript file. So everything inside of this file will be included into the website. Now, JavaScript is massive. It is a huge programming language after all, and there are many, many different things you can do with it. So I'm not really going to teach you JavaScript in this video. Instead, I'm going to give you just a quick example to show you maybe how you could use it. First of all, I'm going to show you where you can learn more. Again, the W3 Schools website that we looked at earlier has the JavaScript reference page to look at, the JavaScript exercises page to practice a little bit, but most importantly, near the top, underneath the JavaScript heading, it has Learn JavaScript. If we click on there, it will take you through a step-by-step, nice and small and gentle JavaScript tutorial to really teach you the language. And there's also a wonderful website called Code Academy, link in the description down below, that has some great free JavaScript online courses to help you learn as well. But for now, I'm just going to showcase that JavaScript actually lets you do cool things, interactive things. It makes the button that I created actually useful. So first of all, I'm going to create a JavaScript function. And to create a JavaScript function, I type the word function, give it a name. I'm just going to type ABC, open and close brackets, and open and close curly brackets, and then give some space. And everything inside of this opening curly bracket and closing curly bracket is my code that will run. Functions are just a collection of multiple lines of code that I can reuse over and over again. I can just call the function, I can just say, hey, function ABC, please run, and everything inside of these curly brackets will run. For this example, I'm going to do something very simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to, when I click this button, I'm going to hide this image. To do that, first of all, I need to wire the button up so it does something. At the moment, inside of the HTML, my button doesn't do anything. To make it do something, inside of the button tag, I give it an attribute that exists called onClick. Okay? And the onClick attribute, obviously onClick equals in speech marks something. The something that goes inside of the speech marks is the name of the function that I want to call when it's on-clicked, when it's clicked. So the name of the function, if you hadn't already guessed it, is ABC. So I'm going to type in here ABC, open and close brackets, save that, and now my button is wired up to this function. Okay, but the function doesn't have any code. So if I just refresh the page and click something and click the button, nothing happens yet because there's no code attached to it. So now I need to, inside of my function, write some code. I'm going to start by writing document.get element by tag name. I'm going to open brackets and speech marks inside of there, and I'm going to type img to get my image, but actually get elements by tag name, multiple elements. So it's going to give me an array of elements, so multiple elements. There is only obviously one, but it's still going to give me an array. So I need to do open square brackets, close square brackets, and 0 to say, hey, from that array, just give me the first one. Remember, in programming, we count from 0. So 0 is really the first one. From there, I will do .style, .display equals, and in speech marks, none. And in JavaScript as well, we use a semicolon to end lines of code. So this line of code is saying document, which is just the page, basically the entire page. This function that exists, which is get elements by tag name. Of course, we know tags are these things. So getting elements by tag name, and I give it img, will get me any elements that have the img tag name. Great. As I said, it gives me an array, so I need to get just the first one out of it. The .style lets me access the element's styling, so it's actual CSS. And the .display is actually a CSS attribute that lets me say if something's being shown, so block, or if something's not being shown, none, like that, for example. I'm going to get rid of that, go back to the JavaScript. So in this case, I'm saying change the display to be none. I'm going to save that, go back to my browser, refresh, and now I'm going to click this button and watch my image disappear. Click, and it's gone. As I said, JavaScript is massive, so please go away and learn it for yourself, but hopefully that gives a very quick example of the power of JavaScript and how it can actually make your website a bit more interactive. For now, that's pretty much where I want to leave this video. There's been a lot of information. Of course, don't forget the W3 Schools website, which is an awesome tool to help you learn HTML, JavaScript, and CSS with great reference sheets and great tutorials. Don't forget the website codepen.io as well, which is that cool website I showed you at the start that lets you edit HTML, JavaScript, and CSS live in your browser, so you don't even need to deal with all the files and anything like that. You can just try some code out, flex your muscles, practice a little bit, and see what you can make happen. So now, from watching this video, hopefully you understand why I give the answer that I do to the question, how do I start coding? With the answer of learn how to make websites, learn HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. I gave my reasons why, I showed you a bit of code, and I hopefully even taught you how to start. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching this video. I appreciate that this is probably quite a long video, so if you've watched all of it, kudos to you. My final usual selfish plug, of course, is to please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and if you like what I do. And don't forget to click that bell icon to get notifications of when new videos are released. And of course, if you want to learn more, or if you have any questions at all for me, please reach out to me at my Twitter handle, Ben_Cadell. Thanks for watching. See you next time.